Thank you to Ross for this challenge, which covers a lot of the basic steps in prep. So what we have is we have students from the East and the West regions, so they look very similar. We have similar field names, so you might be tempted to think, let's union them straight away together because they have those same names. So they look very similar. We've got 7 fields in each of them, but actually just the way they're formatted is slightly differently. So actually in this instance, it's a bit of a good idea to sort those formatting steps out before we stack them on top of one another, or we'd have to write some if statements to deal with the two regions separately. So since I'm on the East students, let's start with the East students. So I want to just quickly change their date of birth to be a date. So in the initial step, it is a string field. So we can just go and change it to a date, and Tableau Prep's pretty clever. It can read this format of date and turn it into a date data type instead for us. So that's great, nice and simple. Then we've got this student ID field which contains the region and the student ID. We want to separate this information out into 2 columns. So what we'll do basically is we'll duplicate that field so that we have 2 of that same field, and from one of them we're going to go to the clean options here and we'll choose remove letters so that we're just left with the numbers, and then the other one we can just remove the numbers. Nice and simple, so that we can clean those up nice and easily and get 2 separate columns with the student ID and the region. For the West students, we need to do something very similar. So for example, with our student ID here, we see it's the number and then a dash and then the region. So we want to split these into 2. So we'll use the split functionality instead, and rather than doing an automatic split, which you might think might work, that actually only returns for us the numeric part of it. So we'll go to a custom split instead, use the dash as our separator, and make sure that we're separating all the fields, and then that'll give us those 2 fields that we just need to rename there to student ID and region. And then finally, before we can bring these 2 together, we can see that we've got grades 1 to 6 in this data set, whereas in the East we have grades as letters. So the way that I chose to get around this was, first of all, made sure I changed this to be a string data type, and then all I did was double click in and rename these A, B, C, D, and so on and so forth. We could write an if statement or a case statement, but in this sort of example, when there's only 6, I think that probably saves me typing out a whole function when I can just do 6 value replaces instead. Of course, we could build up a lookup table to make that even easier on ourselves, but for now, this is the way that I chose to do it. And then we're finally ready to union those 2 tables together, and everything matches up really nicely, all the formats, since we've done these steps beforehand. And the only thing I did in this step as well was get rid of the table names field, because all that tells us is if they're from the East or the West, and we already have a field that tells us that. So next up, in this next step, all I want to do is change this student ID to be numeric, and that's for it to do a join later on to the school lookup. So rather than doing that back in the ID steps and doing that twice, once in each step, I thought I'd wait until I unioned them together and then change their data type all at once. Next up, I want to make their full names of each student, so I am just simply writing a calculation, if I expand the changes field there, where I take the first name, do a little plus sign, have quotation marks with the space in between, another plus sign, and the last name, so I just stick those first names and last names together. And then I can get rid of the first name and last name fields that are in the dataset, because all the information is contained in the full name field now. Then I want to calculate my grade score, so based on these A, B, C, D, E, F grades, we want to assign a score to them, so I used a case statement here rather than an if statement. I thought it would save me a little bit of typing. So when that grade is an A, assign it a value of 50. When it's B, assign it a value of 40, and so on and so forth. So that's how we do that. Now you might have noticed that, for example, each student name appears 3 times here because we have our subject on separate rows. We want them actually each to be a column instead. So let's pivot that. So get our subject as the new headers and take the max grade there. But you'll notice an issue that we're having with our table now, we've got these null values. So where, for example, if I click on a particular student, we want them to only have one row associated with it, but this pivoting at the moment is meaning that we actually just get still one row per subject, but with nulls in all the other rows. So we need to aggregate our data up in order to get rid of this. So if we bring in an aggregate step, I found the easiest way to do this was to say add all fields and then remove the ones we don't want, so we can leave this unique row ID out now. The number of rows isn't something we're interested in, but we want our student ID, our full name, and our date of birth and region to be grouped by. And we want to sum our grade score, definitely. But something that happens when we use this add all option here is that English, science, and maths all come through as group by options, which doesn't help us solve our problem. So instead we need to change this to be either maximum or minimum, so that we're ignoring the null values and only keeping the letter grades instead. So we do that in our aggregation step, and now we have 4,000 rows, so we're no longer having 3 rows for each student, which is great. And now we're ready to bring in our school lookup. So this will just tell us the school name that each of these children go to. So we join those together. On the student ID, we see that we have 4,000 rows in each dataset, and the join result is also 4,000 rows, which is wonderful. So now all we need to do is get rid of that additional student ID field and just move our columns around so that they're in this correct order. Don't worry about the ordering of the rows. Tableau Prep doesn't allow us to control that, and it's not too important anyway. But I hope that was useful, and thanks again to Ross for this challenge. I'm looking forward to seeing how it develops in next week's challenge too.